Tonight, we go back to a Friday night in November 1978, a bright, ordinary burger chef in Speedway, Indiana, where four young people finished their shift and then, in a way that still doesn't make sense, vanished. 2 days later, their bodies were found in the woods. This is still unanswered. I'm Laura McKenney.
And I'm Evan Ralston. We spend a lot of time talking about how small investigative choices can ripple through decades. This case is one of those ripples. The mistakes and the mysteries here shaped how missing person calls are treated today.
Before we get into the timeline, let me say this. These were not faceless victims or tabloid fodder. These were real. Jayne Friedt, 20, assistant manager; Ruth Ellen Shelton, 17, Danny, 16, and Mark Flemmonds, 16. 4 young people working a late shift at a fast food restaurant. That's where it starts. Ordinary.
By the way, Burger Chef was a major chain back then. Over 1,000 locations in the 60s and 70s. It was family-oriented, flame-broiled burgers, fun meals before Happy Meals. So this wasn't some sketchy diner. It was part of everyday life.
Right. Speedway itself, small town just west of Indianapolis, home to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, working and middle class, quiet. The last thing most people expected was that year's violence. And yet, 1978 had a string of unsettling crimes in the area, including bombings and shootings. People talked about whether those things were connected to the Burger Chef case.
That sense of a community losing its sense of safety matters. It colors how investigators respond, how families cope, how rumors fill gaps. Laura, tell us what happened the night of November 17th, 1978.
Okay, so Friday night, November 17th, around 11 p.m., the closing shift at the Burger Chef on Crawfordsville Road in Speedway is finishing up, cleaning grills, taking out trash, locking up, getting the safe ready. Jayne, the assistant manager, was in charge of closing and handling the safe. Mark was covering for someone. He wasn't scheduled that night. Danny was a brand new hire. Reportedly, he hadn't gotten his first paycheck yet. Ruth was a high schooler who also worked another job. Ordinary kids doing an ordinary job.
The hypothesis from investigators later was that the attack may have begun when they took trash out the back door. That's a moment when the back door might be open, when the crew would be in a more secluded spot on the property.
Yeah, and here's where the first catastrophic mistake happens. Around midnight, a coworker stops by and finds the restaurant empty, the back door ajar, the safe open, cash drawers open, 2 empty currency bags, and an empty roll of tape near the safe. Purses and jackets, the victim's personal items, were still inside. But police concluded quickly that the teens had taken the money and run. They assumed a runaway or petty theft.
And that assumption killed the crime scene. They allowed employees to clean and reopen the restaurant. No photographs of the original scene were taken. Evidence that might have been latent prints, traces, was contaminated or destroyed. Speedway officer Buddy Elranger later admitted, quote, "We screwed it up from the beginning." That line, it's brutal, but it tells you everything you need to know.
Yeah, it really does. Evan, can you explain why that kind of mistake matters so much? Because listeners might hear they cleaned it and think, well, okay, that's bad. But why does it make prosecutions so much harder decades later?
Good question, Laura. When a scene is processed properly, investigators document everything: photos, measurements, preserved samples. That preserves a chain of custody and gives you context. Latent prints lifted intact can be run through databases. Fibers and hairs can be compared. Trace evidence ties people to places. When a scene is cleaned and re-entered by dozens of people, you lose the ability to say whether a piece of evidence belonged to a suspect or just to the thousands of other people who walk through later. For cold cases, that original documentation is often what you need to bring charges decades later.
So, the damaged chain is both physical and evidentiary. Okay. The four didn't show up at home the next day. Jayne's Chevy Vega was found abandoned, partially locked, in town. By Saturday, it became clear this wasn't a simple runaway. Then, 2 days after the shift, on Sunday afternoon, November 19, hikers find the bodies in rural Johnson County, about 15 to 20 miles from the Burger Chef.
The scene in the woods is chilling and confusing. All four were still in their uniforms. Ruth and Danny were found face down, side by side, each shot multiple times in the head or neck with a .38 caliber firearm. Jayne was found 50 to 75 yards away, stabbed twice in the chest. An old hunting-style knife blade left broken inside her chest. Mark was found farthest from the group, near a creek, with severe blunt force trauma to the head and face, possibly beaten with a chain, and he choked on his own blood. Money and watches were still on the bodies, which made the robbery motive much murkier.
Right. Money on the bodies. Coats and purses left at the restaurant. Those inconsistencies were glaring. But even after the bodies were found, evidence collection at the rural scene was imperfect. Vehicles were driven into the clearing, which likely disturbed footprints and tracks. So it was a double blow. The restaurant cleaned and the woods trampled.
And from a behavioral standpoint, the variety of killing methods, shooting, stabbing, blunt force, raises questions about the perpetrators. It suggests possibly multiple attackers with different methods or a chaotic situation where things escalated unpredictably.
Let's humanize the victims for a few minutes. Jayne Friedt was 20, the assistant manager responsible for closing. She drove that Chevy Vega. The autopsy showed the knife blade broke off in her chest, a 4.5-inch hunting-style blade. Ruth Ellen Shelton, usually listed as 17, worked at Burger Chef and Dunkin' Donuts. Her sister Teresa later described her as having a sense of humor and being excited to turn 18. Danny Davis was 16, a new hire who'd reportedly not yet gotten his first paycheck. He had a quiet personality, liked photography, even talked about joining the Air Force. And Mark Flemmonds, 16, was covering a shift. He wasn't scheduled to be there that night. That unscheduled presence becomes a central thread in many theories.
Those personal details matter. They make it hard to accept theories that the kids were somehow deserving of suspicion. People had lives, plans, hobbies. Danny's first paycheck detail is especially cruel. He hadn't even been paid yet. It underscores how ordinary and unnecessary this violence was.
I agree. Dr. Rolston, there were witnesses who said they saw suspicious men earlier that night, right? 2 teens reported 2 men near the restaurant about an hour before the abduction. Can you walk listeners through the witness sketches and hypnosis work?
Sure. 2 teenage boys reported seeing 2 suspicious men behind the Burger Chef near the railroad tracks. One bearded, one clean-shaven. Investigators used a police hypnotist, this was common in the 70s, to help the teens recall details. After hypnosis, artists made composite sketches, and the teens reportedly said the sketches were 90 to 95% accurate. Sculptors later made clay busts from those sketches. Several persons of interest have been linked to those composites over the years, but none were definitively tied to the murders in court.
By the way, Police hypnosis was controversial even then, and is much more so now. It can create false memories or overconfidence in shaky recollections. But at the time, it seemed like a promising tool. The composites kept the case in the public eye and gave investigators leads. But again, no one was convicted.
Exactly. One of the more dramatic episodes in the investigation involves an undercover encounter in a bar. SRG Virgil Vandegrift, working leads, reportedly played pool with a man who bragged about the murders, mimed snapping a pool cue to demonstrate something he'd done, allegedly. According to reporting, the man all but confessed. But when formally questioned and polygraphed, he denied involvement and passed, and there was no physical evidence that tied him to the scene. So he was released.
That case is infuriating. You have someone bragging, others hearing it, but you still need corroboration. And if you don't have preserved crime scene evidence, your options narrow. Then, in 1986, 8 years after the murders, Donald Ray Forrester surfaces. Evan, tell us about Forrester and why his confession was so complicated.
Donald Forrester was an inmate with a violent past. He reached out to authorities claiming involvement and provided detailed descriptions of the killings, details he supposedly wouldn't have known if he were lying. For example, he described types of wounds and positions of the bodies that weren't widely public at the time. His ex-wife told police he once drove her to a wooded area shortly after the murders to retrieve shell casings, which he later flushed down a toilet. Investigators searched the house's septic tank and recovered several spent .38 shell casings, which seemed to match the caliber used on Ruth and Danny.
That sounds like the kind of breakthrough you'd dream of in a cold case. But then Forrester recanted, right? He said his confession was false and that he'd learned details from other sources. He also failed polygraphs on key elements. The result was messy. Some detectives thought he was telling the truth. Others thought he was fabricating. No charges were ever brought. Forrester died in prison in 2006.
Yes. The casings in a septic tank are tantalizing, but not definitive. Ballistic matches require intact comparisons to a known gun, and without that, a casing shows only that a suspect had access to .38 ammunition. It ties him to a caliber, not necessarily to the murder weapon. And recanted confessions, especially from incarcerated people, are fraught. Motives for false confessions can include seeking attention, bargaining for privileges, or lying to other inmates.
I still think about the families. Teresa Jeffries Ruth's sister has been a public voice, saying she hoped to have answers before her time on Earth is gone. The case has lingered for decades with no formal resolution. Evan, what about the physical evidence that remains? Knife blade, palm print, casings. How have they fared with modern forensics?
The knife blade, about 4.5 inches, hunting style, was photographed and publicly released on the 40th anniversary in 2018 to solicit tips. There were bullets and .38 casings collected, including those from the septic tank. A palm print was lifted from Jayne's Chevy Vega, and advances in biometric databases eventually produced a hit on that print, but the person identified was later ruled out of suspicion. Over the years, evidence has been resubmitted for modern testing, including touch DNA techniques post-2010s, but there have been no publicly announced DNA matches that broke the case. The problem is twofold: contamination from early mishandling and limits on what was collected in the first place.
So even as technology advances, the degradation or loss of context from 1978 limits what we can do now. Still, investigators have kept the case open. The Indiana State Police maintain it as a cold case. They held a press conference on the 40th anniversary asking people to come forward. S. Sergeant Bill Dalton said, It's time to unload that secret. Powerful line.
And the community still feels it. The original Burger Chef building stood for decades, housing various businesses, and it was ultimately demolished in December 2023. Locals described it as a dark reminder. Some felt relief when it came down. Others worried the physical erasure might let the story fade. But the loss of a building doesn't erase the need for answers.
Right. Let's step back and talk about major investigative theories that have circulated. A robbery crew that botched a job, a drug-related retaliation, Forrester's claim, and that local people simply know more than they say. Evan, what's the most plausible theory from a criminologist's perspective?
The theory many investigators gravitated toward over time is the robbery crew hypothesis. A group committing fast food robberies in the region targeted Burger Chef. Something went wrong. Maybe Mark, who wasn't scheduled, recognized someone. Maybe someone resisted, and the crew decided to eliminate witnesses. Support for this includes patterns of restaurant robberies at the time and ISP's focus on such a crew. Weaknesses include the varied killing methods and the fact that valuables remained on the bodies. But multiple perpetrators and panic can explain those inconsistencies.
And the drug theory. There were rumors about small-time marijuana dealing connected to one of the employees or trafficking near the restaurant. That feeds a narrative of targeted retaliation, but that's unproven and dangerous to repeat without solid evidence. It can unfairly stain victims' reputations, something we must avoid.
Exactly. We have to be careful distinguishing rumor from evidence. Forrester's account sits in the middle. He offered details and there were casings in a septic tank, but he recanted and failed polygraphs. Investigators remain divided. Then there's the social theory, that people in Speedway knew more than they said. Years of secrecy or fear, loyalty, or simple silence can protect perpetrators. SRG Balton's plea suggests the ISP believes someone out there has crucial information.
Let's talk a little about police culture then, and how it affected the case. Evan, you teach about investigative failures from the 1970s. What lessons did the Burger Chef case teach the profession?
Several lessons. First, never make assumptions about missing teens, especially when they're employees closing a business. Second, treat any unusual, unattended commercial scene as potentially a crime scene until proven otherwise. Third, document thoroughly. Photos, perimeter control, chain of custody. The Burger Chef case is often cited as a cautionary tale in training. Poor early decisions limit investigative options for decades. Police resource limits and cultural biases in the 1970s, like seeing teens as runaways or pranksters, played a role here.
And yet, I want to be fair. Many officers were working in an era before modern missing person protocols existed. Still, the haste to assume a prank had real consequences. Evan, a detail that always gets me, the coral of witnesses, including the two teens who made sketches, the bar suspect who bragged, and others, keeps hinting that someone talked, or almost talked. Why do communities so often keep dangerous silences?
A mix of reasons. Fear of retaliation, loyalty, not wanting to get involved, distrust of police, or even the belief that someone else will tell. Over time, forgetfulness, alcohol, or shifting memories can erode those stories. But many cold cases hinge on one person deciding to speak up. That's why reminders, anniversaries, and public appeals can matter, even decades later.
Which brings us to the emotional toll. Families have lived a lifetime without answers. Teresa Jeffries said her mother never got over it. That phrase, never got over it, is how so many of these cold cases are best understood. Evan, Do you think it's likely we'll ever get arrests in this case?
Realistically, possibilities shrink over time. Perpetrators age, die, or move. Memories fade. But cold case breakthroughs do happen. New forensic techniques, a tip, a confession. The presence of preserved physical evidence, knife blade, casings, prints, means there is still a pathway, however narrow. The caveat? The original mishandling greatly reduced the chance of a full, provable prosecution.
So, hope is faint, but real. We're nearly at the end of our deep dive, but we want to leave listeners with concrete takeaways and ways they can help, not just emotionally, but practically. Evan, what would you tell someone who thinks they might know something?
Contact law enforcement. The Indiana State Police keep the case open and have asked people to come forward. Even a small-seeming detail, someone recalling a truck in a driveway, a strange conversation, an overheard confession at a bar, could be the missing link. Anonymity can sometimes be preserved through tip lines. The point is, speak up. Big cases have been solved because a neighbor decided to tell what they knew.
And if you live in Speedway and you pass by where that burger chef used to stand, now demolished, remember, these were people with names, plans, futures. Jayne, Ruth, Danny, Mark. Not just a case file, not just a cautionary tale. Evan, one last question for you. If you could go back to November 1978 with one change investigators could make, what would it be?
Treat the restaurant as a potential crime scene from the moment it's discovered empty and unexplained. Secure the perimeter, photograph everything, and don't allow cleaning or reopening. That single change preserves the possibility of identifying suspects through physical evidence. It's simple in words, impossible to overstate in impact.
Simple and devastating. To the families listening, Teresa, other family members, this podcast is a reminder that history keeps tracing these injuries. We keep talking, we keep asking, we keep hoping.
If you have information you're willing to share, call the Indiana State Police or local investigators handling the cold case. And if you don't have first-hand info, keep this story alive. Conversations are sometimes the maintenance work for justice.
Before we close, a quick recap for listeners who want the highlights. November 17, 1978, closing shift at Burger Chef. The restaurant is found empty around midnight. Initial police assumption of runaway or theft leads to cleaning and reopening. November 19, bodies found in Johnson County woods. 4 victims: Jayne Friedt, 20, Ruth Ellen Shelton, 17, Daniel Davis, 16, Mark Flemmonds, 16, each killed in different ways. Major investigative threads include robberies of fast food restaurants, the Donald Forrester confession and septic tank casings, witness sketches from hypnotized teens, and a long-running belief that locals may know more than they've said.
And the remaining pieces of evidence: the knife blade, .38 casings, a palm print from Jayne's vehicle that produced a candidate who was later ruled out, and other trace items that survived imperfectly. The Indiana State Police keep the investigation open and have re-examined materials using modern techniques, but as of now, there is no arrest linked to the murders.
One small, practical request. If you heard this episode and you have something to say, no matter how small, please contact the ISP. Sometimes small things put together create a big picture. And if you're carrying a secret about those nights in 1978, this is a plea to come forward. Sergeant Dalton's words, it's time to unload that secret.
Laura, thank you for steering this. This case is a painful example of how ordinary nights can turn tragic and how mistakes cost time and truth. To the listeners, keep remembering, keep asking, keep the victims human.
Thank you, Evan. And thank you, everyone, for listening. We'll include resources and links on our show notes if you want to read more. Indiana State Police cold case pages, the long-form Indianapolis Monthly story, and some of the survivor and family interviews collected in recent coverage. We'll be back next week with another still unanswered case. Until then, I'm Laura McKenney.
And I'm Evan Ralston. Stay curious, stay compassionate.
Goodbye.